Canada's environmental policies have been at the forefront of some of the country's most controversial economic debates, and tomorrow's expected Senator report on Bill C-69 could set the precedent for what happens next. Here to discuss what is at stake for the energy sector, as well as other sectors across Canada, and alongside, of course, protecting the environment, is Brett Wilson, chairman at Canoe Financial. Joining us from Ottawa is Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada, and also in Ottawa, Josh Ginsberg, lawyer at Ecojustice. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much to everyone for being part of this conversation. We've got a lot of different views here, which we want to get to everybody and everything. But Brett, let me just start with you. I want our viewers to really understand what Bill C-69 is, just real brief, and why you are so against it as it relates to the energy industry and perhaps what it will do to the lack of pipelines being built.
Well, the proponents of 69, Bill 69 and Bill C-48, you can't ignore one without the other, are well-intended in the thought that we're going to be more efficient in the development of our infrastructure, which will allow us to bring our resources to market. Unfortunately, as it's structured, again, nothing to do with intent, but as it's structured, it fails. It will landlock. We're already having enough trouble getting proper approvals put through. We've already got approvals for pipelines that are being blocked by people at various levels. So either democracy works or it doesn't, but the thought that we're going to block Canada from participating in the global economy is what we're basically doing with C-48. No tanker ban anywhere else in the world. We allow oil to come in. We're making no effort to block the oil transported along our coast or into our country. No effort whatsoever. So that's where the hypocrisy and the disingenuous approach that's being taken by those who are proponents fails.
Josh, let me have you respond to Brett's comments, because when Brett is talking about the blocking of these pipelines, part of the reason behind Bill C-69 is to potentially help projects get built, because supposedly, according to the Liberal proposal, they won't get blocked in the core system.
Well, yes, and let me give the background here that this bill exists in, which is that Canada and indeed the world are facing a twin set of emergencies. There's the climate emergency, which we know we've got just a little more than a decade to take action on, or we're going to be locked in to the very worst effects of climate change. And then we have the biodiversity emergency, which is that we are losing species and ecosystem diversity at a very alarming rate. So we need to get on top of this. And we have not been, partly because we've not had a good system of evaluating the impacts of the biggest projects that do cause a lot of these problems. So Bill C-69 is a better way to have these conversations and actually puts on the table a list of issues that are relevant to having those conversations. Industry players, and I have to say particularly the oil and gas industry, are ringing a false alarm here about the supposed damage that this bill is going to cause. In fact, it is a very modest and incremental improvement on the system we have now, which everybody agrees isn't working. So this system does a few very subtle and important things to make sure we're having better conversations and are taking into account important things in the face of two real crises.
Elizabeth, let me have you weigh in on this, because you said that this is getting debated right now in Ottawa. And in terms of just a few minor tweaks that Josh referred to, when I take a look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but within mining, as an example, there are at least 10 thresholds that have been increased in terms of increasing difficulty or higher tests, a higher bar in terms of getting projects approved. 10. That doesn't seem like just a few.
Well, the Mining Association of Canada, just to use mining as a sector, was significantly disadvantaged when Stephen Harper's government repealed the Environmental Assessment Act we'd had since Brian Mulroney moved it forward. I'm actually not a fan of C-69. I think that it puts in concrete a very weakened approach to environmental assessment, which will mean that the federal government abdicates its responsibility to ensure that it assesses any project that involves federal jurisdiction. The whole tilt has gone far too much towards we're only going to look at the big projects. I think it violates the election promises the Liberals made to repair the damage that Harper did to our environmental laws. But just to back up and say, this is primarily and should be primarily a bill about making sure the federal government does its homework. Nixon brought in been such a law in the U.S. in his administration. And at that point, Canada adopted an approach through order in council. It wasn't legislated. But since 1976, the federal government had always reviewed projects if it was within federal jurisdiction, small and large projects. No project was ever turned down until Stephen Harper's government came in, and then they repealed the whole scheme of the legislation. Unfortunately, C-69 is, I think, so inadequate that I voted against it. But the hysteria on the side of the oil and gas sector, I agree with Josh, it's completely wrong to say this is an anti-pipeline bill. It could just as easily be a pro-pipeline bill because it's so flawed that it allows ministerial discretion at many points without a thorough evaluation. And it certainly means that thousands of projects within federal jurisdiction will never be evaluated, but will continue to have these conflicts over pipelines.
Brett, how do you respond to this? Go ahead, Josh.
Let me jump in and say, if I can, thank you, that I absolutely agree with Elizabeth. This is not the bill that the environmental community wanted. This is not the fundamental reform of environmental assessment that we think this country really needs. What it was a compromise, a very delicate compromise between environmental interests and other interests. And yes, we say the bill absolutely does not go far enough, but it does do a few really important things in my view. And one is that it brings issues to the forefront at an early planning stage. And this is something that proponents do now, but they do it in an informal way that doesn't necessarily influence the process. This brings the government to the table and the proponent and stakeholders at the very earliest stage of the project to talk about what's really at issue here. What are going to be the things that we really have to debate and we can't move on to discuss without. Ironing out some of the problems that really tie up these things in protests and indeed in litigation. So that's really important. The second thing is that it actually articulates a list of factors that have to be taken into consideration so we don't have to fight about each and every project, what's relevant, what isn't relevant. That's really important. It creates space for regional and strategic assessments, so high-level policy discussions that are going to inform the project-level assessments. That's something that's never been done before, certainly not on a scale that's had any impact.
Doesn't it
lastly,
also, let me ask, because this is important, doesn't it also, in its original form, give the environment minister the ultimate power of delaying projects indefinitely?
And that's where we suffer
so let me
in terms
ask,
of, as a nation, when we allow that sort of discretion to step in. And many of the comments made by our colleagues on this panel talk about sort of the pro-environment. We have to protect the environment, which is another way of saying we're anti-pipelines. We will not allow incremental production from the oil sands. We will not allow any tankers to be shipped. Go back to Bill C-48. And yet globally, we've gone in the last decade from 95 million barrels a day of production to over 100. So the economy globally for energy is growing. We've not stopped a single barrel from being produced. The hypocrisy of the efforts that are being made to landlock Alberta, and it's been stated, many groups, Ecojustice, Lead Now, Change.org, many have said, Dogwood, have said, we want to landlock the Alberta oil industry as an example to the world. But in the meantime, the world continues to grow. So we need a process that allows us to be efficient. We have the most regulated and thoughtful energy industry in the world. If the world was to produce at the same greenhouse gas intensity that we do, we'd be down by 23% tomorrow. So instead of worrying so much about what Canada's doing to participate in the global economy, why aren't any of these groups using genuine efforts to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a global basis? No effort whatsoever outside of Canada. So, that's the hypocrisy.
And why is that the case, Josh? Why is that the case? Because when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, Canada, from the data I've seen, is 1.6%. You look at China, 23%, United States, 44%. Okay, we'll take 44.
Well,
and look at the United States, it's double digits as well. Why isn't there more focus on what's going on outside of our borders?
Why isn't there any focus?
No
There's
focus.
None.
Well, there
whatsoever.
absolutely is. On a per capita basis, of course, Canada emits huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, the Environmental Quality Index, which is a report that's prepared by Yale and Columbia researchers, says that we are at the bottom of the barrel, one of the worst performing countries in the entire world when it comes to getting our greenhouse gas emissions under control. And I have to say, I find this kind of discourse a little bit sad to say that, well, Canada's so small, we've got no role, we can't do anything.
Nobody
When we've
said
had
that.
other great crises.
But we didn't
like
say that.
When we've had
Nobody's
world
even
wars,
hinted,
Canada
Josh,
has always
that
done
there's
its
no
share,
role.
and no one has said, well, maybe another partner won't do their share, so Canada ought not to act. That's shirking our responsibility.
But here's one
We have to
thing.
do our part.
We cannot lead with 1.6%.
Of course we can.
And the hypocrisy,
Of course we can.
Elizabeth, the hypocrisy of participating.
Don't you remember that we led to save the ozone layer? Do you remember that Canada led? Don't diminish our role in the world, Brett. We have the capacity to lead, but only if we come to an issue with clean hands and we've done our homework
We can
ourselves.
lead
That's
with
what Brian
action.
Mulroney did with
we can
acid
lead
rain.
with technology. There's ways we can
lead.
but we can't lead with 1.6% and make a difference to the globe. So we need to do
Sure
what we
we
can.
can.
We're not going to argue that. But going from 1.6 to 1.5 accomplishes nothing on a global basis. And when we have the groups that are attacking our industries, the energy industry, the mining industry, all of our infrastructure needs, when all of those are attacking only Canada, there's something disingenuous about that extraordinary hypocrisy that undermines Canada, and that's what makes me upset about people who take the position that you're taking.
Look, I'm never going to attack Canada. I love this country. I serve this country. And there is, of course, I've shown it. I've called for refineries and bitumen upgraders in Alberta to create more good jobs in Alberta so Canadians can use a product. Why do you presume that there's no market for Canadian bitumen except overseas where people don't want it? It's a very low quality product that costs a lot to produce. So we should be looking at a market that's Canadian. That's why for British Columbians looking at high gas prices, a lot of it is because we are having to buy gas back from the United States, not because we don't have pipelines, but because Kinder Morgan shifted its product from being a crude that can be used in the Burnaby refinery to one that can't be used because it's solid bitumen, cost us 1/3 of the production level from what was the Chevron refinery, now Parkland. They had to lay off 1/3 of their workforce. Why? Because Kinder Morgan preferred raw bitumen for export instead of jobs for Canadians here.
Do you know there's an
And
export
that's a fact.
pipeline being requested so that we could incrementally ship fuel? It's called TMX, and it's an expansion pipeline that goes down the same right-of-way that the existing pipeline goes down. You should look that up, Elizabeth.
It follows a different
For all
route. I
practical
was an intervener in the
purposes, it's the
NEB
same
process. I'm quite familiar. No, it's not. It crosses 800 waterways between the Alberta-BC border and the port of disembarkation in Burnaby. Any tanker leaving the port of Burnaby is more likely to be taking that diluted bitumen to California because there isn't an Asian market. That whole argument is a house of cards without any evidence. And I really do think we need to look at what's in our national economic interest and not be thinking it makes sense to pit British Columbians against Albertans when there's a solution that helps both of our economies.
That's what's happening. And I just want to clarify one point. There's no market in China for our product?
No, that's not true.
That's not true?
Yes,
no.
Correct.
So this is why we're having this conversation. Elizabeth,
Catherine,
can I just say why I say that?
We're actively importing oil from foreign countries into the east coast of Canada.
Which we shouldn't be doing.
So if we were working in Canada's interest, we'd be expanding our industry at the same rate the global industry is expanding.
Which would be what percent?
3 to 5.
Okay, so we should be growing our energy industry 3 to 5%.
That's just on a global basis.
No, we should.
Now we have the ability to grow faster.
Okay, Elizabeth, go ahead.
I know, sorry, for viewers, before we went on air, Catherine said jump in, so I really hate to jump in. But look, we are, just to give you the figures, we are importing to Eastern Canada 700,000 barrels of oil a day.
From
We're having
where?
This horrible fight.
Let
me finish this. Let me just get the numbers out. 700,000 barrels of oil a day is imported to Eastern Canada, and this bitter, nasty fight that we shouldn't be having between Alberta and BC is over less, 590,000 barrels of solid bitumen for export a day. Now, we're importing it from Venezuela, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and still a bit from Norway. The Saudi oil, by the way, only goes to the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. There's not a lot of other people using it, but the Irvings like it because it's cheap and it's higher quality, and they're not prepared to build an upgrader to deal with bitumen. So the upgrades should be in Alberta, create more jobs in Alberta, make sure we're not increasing our overall production, but getting more jobs and more value added out of every barrel produced. And once Canadian needs are met, then maybe we export. But this fight over exports is so divisive and so unhelpful, and there are other solutions that come from a place of common ground.
Josh, weigh in here in terms
and if I can just add this. Well, I was just going to say that this is why strategic environmental assessments are so important, and regional environmental assessments are so important, because we can have the kind of strategic discussion that's going on now. Where ought we to be putting our resources to have maximum effect to both create good projects and meet our climate agreement, our international agreements under Paris? What are the right kind of investments that are going to get us where we need to go? Right now, we take an ad hoc, project-by-project approach. We never look at the big picture. One thing that Bill C-69 will do is provide a space to do those high-level assessments, and it will fund them. There's funding that goes along with it so that these might actually happen. So the kind of discussions we're having here, what we can have as a nation, as a country.
Josh, okay, go ahead, Brett.
Joshua, which of the pipelines do you consider good infrastructure? Is it Keystone XL? Is it Gateway? Is it Energy East? Or is it TMX? Which of those are you in favor of?
The whole point, Brett, is that we have to assess all of these projects on their merits and in the context of a larger strategic plan. And we've been thoroughly
but from your
unable
perspective,
to do that.
which of these works for you? Is Gateway out because it's C-48? Is it Energy East because we're happy to import oil from countries that don't give a damn about the rights of women, children, or the environment? Or is it Keystone XL, which Trump wants us to bring across the border as soon as he's ready? Which of those works for you? And don't say none, because some of them
question,
are.
I think it is.
But it is the question.
The question makes no sense, Brett. The question
well, of course
makes no
it makes no sense to you.
The question is, should we be exporting raw bitumen? I'm not
should
against.
We be exporting
there's no
oil?
Pipeline I'm for or against without knowing what's in the pipeline.
Okay, let's assume it's just oil.
Should Canadians? Well, let's just assume that we have an interest in. Let's just say energy policy should be framed with what meets the maximum number of jobs for production of that resource. And the Greens would apply this to raw logs for export, shipping our fish to China, shipping it back to have it in our supermarkets. We should not be exporting raw product before we get the value added and the maximum number of jobs in Canada. In terms of energy policy, we should look at energy security, which we don't, because if for some reason the oil stopped being shipped into Eastern Canada, there is actually no plan for a backup if suddenly OPEC nations stop shipping their oil.
So you would support Energy East. I agree.
No,
Why not?
because Energy East would take raw bitumen to the Port of St. John to export it, because no refinery in Eastern Canada can refine raw bitumen because they don't have upgraders,
that we ship
and they have
grade
no
of crude
intention
oil.
of building one.
Okay, we can ship another grade of crude oil. You know that.
The more refined, the more refined the product is, the less threat it is to the environment. The worst threat to the environment in terms of a spill is diluted bitumen, because it separates and we can't clean it up. Can't clean it up in fresh water, can't clean it up in a marine environment. So diluting bitumen, but by the way, there's a pipeline that Kinder Morgan held onto because it makes money, and it runs from the U.S. up to Alberta. It's called the Cochin Pipeline, and it ships very toxic, dangerous fossil fuel condensate, which is then stirred in to solid bitumen for the sole purpose of getting something solid to flow through a pipeline to ship to refineries in other countries.
You said that condensate was toxic.
It defines stupid.
Let me just go back, though, to something that
highly toxic.
Let me just go back to something that Brett asked Josh, which was, what pipeline are you in favor of? If you're for Bill C-69 because you want the projects to have a higher assessment test, what projects would you be in favor of?
Who's that question directed
that's
to?
for
I said the
Josh.
question
That's
makes no
for
sense, and
Josh.
it doesn't.
You don't understand it?
I said the question makes no sense, and it doesn't.
Why?
Because the whole point of C-69 is that we need a better process to assess these pipelines and other projects. And let's remember, by the way, that the bill is about a lot more than pipelines.
I know.
The oil and gas question kind of dominates the discussion a lot, but actually it's every single project, including renewable projects, by the way.
Right.
And we should start to think
mining
about whether
and transportation.
it makes sense to make more space.
But look, the reason, Josh,
Absolutely.
the reason why I'm asking you what might make sense in terms of how we move forward and what a potential solution is because this is such a divided issue amongst Canadians across across Canada right now. We are talking about Premier Kenney taking a look at the Constitution and looking at transfer payments and wondering if perhaps they want to pull those back. This is dividing the country. Many CEOs have come on BNN Bloomberg and said that this is hurting our economy. People are now speaking out more and more about that. Where is the compromise, from your perspective, Josh, that we can get to make sure that this is of shared interest, both from the environment as well as the economy? Do you see that? Do you have hopes for that, or absolutely not? That's my question to you.
I do have a little bit of hope, yes, under the Bill C-69 as it's currently written, if the Senate doesn't tear it apart, which is another question. You use the word compromise, and that's exactly right. The bill is a compromise because, we're doing impact assessments under this bill, which would incorporate the total value to Canada of a given project, and the economic opportunities to communities are part of that. I'm a bit concerned that the bill doesn't provide for rules to actually deal effectively with trade-offs between environmental outcomes on one hand and economic ones on the other. I think that's, Elizabeth, what you were hinting at earlier. It's one of the ways the bill falls short, but at least it opens up the space to have those kind of conversations. And that is the compromise that the bill strikes between the environmental movement and other interests.
At the end of the day,
when these projects that you're talking about get, yes.
But one point of clarification, and Elizabeth, this is to you. In the bill, does it not give the environment minister the power to single-handedly delay projects, period? So in other words, everything that we're talking about in terms of all the other details don't actually matter. Is that correct?
Can I mention one thing quickly?
But is that a correct assessment? Is that in the bill?
Well, I think the bill needs to be better understood, that it's actually 3 bills in one, which is another big problem with it. But let me just say, you could just as easily say this bill lets the Minister of Environment jump in and approve a project before it's finished. In other words, I think the bill is very flawed. I could not vote for it. I think it needs massive amendments before it meets a minimum threshold of adequately doing environmental reviews. By the way, if you look at pipelines that don't get covered in this bill, because this was what happened when Stephen Harper repealed the legislation we'd had for decades that never caused any trouble. But ever since 2012, we've been operating under a scheme that's all about project lists instead of starting from the point of view of federal jurisdiction. And we had a jet fuel pipeline approved by the Vancouver Airport Authority with the Minister of Transportation not even knowing about it, that threatens sensitive salmon spawning grounds. In other words, the bill should not just be about big projects. It shouldn't be focused on pipelines. It should be focused on what is federal jurisdiction and how do we assess the impact of a project as early in the planning stage as possible, right across federal jurisdiction. If it's federal land, federal money, or under a permit issued by a federal minister. And I'm afraid that this bill, and Catherine McKenna, I know she was bending over backwards to appease the industry. That hasn't worked for her. The industry is attacking this bill as if it was really an anti-pipeline bill. But what it really is a failure to do what's required under federal jurisdiction and reassure industry that this will be predictable, transparent, work well, and not end up with so many pipelines ending up in court, which really started when Stephen Harper repealed our environmental assessment legislation.
We can go back in time all we want. We can talk about the past, but we need to talk about the present and the future. And right now, the hypocrisy of the environmental movement in terms of attacking what we're doing in Canada, allowing foreign oil to come in, not worrying about the growth of the oil industry on a global basis makes no sense. Do I love the planet? Do I love the earth? Do I love Canada? All of the above is true. We need to use the earth thoughtfully, and we can't get there with Bill 69 or 60 or 48. Neither of those make sense.
And we have to leave it there.
48 makes a lot of sense.
Elizabeth, we have to leave it there. I'm sorry, I still wanted to get to carbon tax as well as the carbon footprint of electric vehicles, but we don't have time even for that.
We could do this. We could do this every week.
Let's
we'll
do it.
Again.
I'm game.
Okay, everybody's game.
Let's
We're going to do that.
have a standing invitation.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate your
Thank you
time.
both.
That is Brett Wilson, Chairman at Canoe Financial.
Thanks,
Elizabeth
Josh.
May, leader of the Green Party of Canada, and also Josh Ginsberg, lawyer at Ecojustice.